was a striking example of the party failing to even pretend that substance guides its work in any significant way. But it was emblematic of a much larger truth. In recent years, Republicans have brought their post-policy posture to practically every debate and every issue. Some of this can be explained by GOP officials being put in a position to exercise governmental power despite an ideological disposition that's reflexively antagonistic toward the non-military public sector. As the New York Times' Neil Irwin wrote early on in Donald Trump's presidency, most Republican officials routinely have an aversion to doing the messy work of making policy. If you make a career opposing even the basic work of making the government run, it's hard to pivot to writing major legislation. But more often than not, Republicans simply find it easier to bypass the rigors of real policymaking. Reading policy analyses, attending hearings, negotiating with rivals and stakeholders, and thinking through the consequences of policy decisions requires countless hours of tiresome and unglamorous work. Peddling poll-tested, base-motivating, half-baked hashtag-ready talking points, on the other hand, is both painless and ideologically satisfying. For GOP officials, this doesn't seem to be an especially tough call. If the party's candidates and office holders were punished by voters over their disinterest toward governing, they'd have no choice but to take their official responsibilities more seriously. But Republicans' post-policy attitudes have also been embraced by many of the party's supporters. And so long as GOP candidates can win elections while being lazy about policymaking, they have little incentive to change. The implications of this approach to modern governance are all-encompassing. Voters routinely elect Republicans to the nation's most powerful offices, expecting GOP policymakers to have the technocratic wherewithal to identify problems, weigh alternative solutions, forge coalitions, accept compromises, and apply some level of governmental competence, if not expertise. The party has consistently proven those hopes misguided. By any fair measure, the GOP excels at acquiring power and exploiting electoral structures to keep it, often in defiance of the American electorate's will. Republicans may fail in breathtaking fashion when trying to govern, but they have unrivaled expertise in gerrymandering and voter suppression techniques. The shortcoming quickly becomes evident after Election Day, when Republicans roll up their sleeves and clumsily try to use that power in pursuit of their ostensible priorities. Making matters worse, while our Madisonian model of government expects the governing process to include a series of compromises between parties, between chambers, between competing branches of government engaged in a tug-of-war for power and influence, the GOP's shift into post-policy politics short-circuits the process itself. One of the more common questions mainstream voters ask routinely is why the two major parties so often seem incapable of working together toward common goals. Much has been written in recent years about the asymmetric relationship between Democrats and Republicans, the degree to which the latter have become radicalized in ways the former have not, and the effects of this dynamic. As political scientists Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann documented in their seminal work, 2012's It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the Politics of Extremism, those observations are rooted in uncontested facts. But the GOP's transition into a post-policy party represents a large piece of the same ugly mosaic. The United States' two major parties are no longer simply offering different answers to the same questions. They're now asking entirely different kinds of questions. There is no point on a common continuum at which to reach compromise. The Democrats' approach is consistently substantive. When party officials consider a policy challenge, they tend to act deliberately, evaluating the granular details in ways Republicans rarely consider. The point isn't that Democrats are always right. They're not. But rather that they at least make a point of approaching their governing responsibilities in ways that reflect a degree of seriousness and due diligence. Too often, when the modern Republican Party controls the levers of federal power, it decides in-depth scrutiny of major legislation is neither necessary nor desirable, since it would produce unsatisfying information the party would be inclined to ignore anyway. The GOP's post-policy evolution, or